In a small town in Nigeria, there lived a couple named Richard and Grace. They were known by everyone in the village because they always seemed happy and lived comfortably. They had a beautiful house with a well-kept garden. To the outside world, they seemed like an ordinary couple living a peaceful life. Richard was a tall man, well-dressed, and always smiling. Grace, his wife, was kind and always helped the neighbors with small tasks. They had a young daughter named Mary, who was always running around and playing in the yard. Despite their happy appearance, Richard and Grace were hiding a dark secret. Richard had a friend, a man named John, who was known for making people rich quickly. John was a man of many secrets, and he had the power to make people rich if they did something terrible. Richard and Grace did not care about the harm it would cause, they were desperate for money. They had heard many stories about how John could change a person's life overnight. So, they decided to meet with him. One evening, Richard told Grace that they needed more money to live a better life. Grace agreed. She wanted to give Mary the best things in life, and she was willing to do anything to make it happen. They went to John's house deep in the village forest, where no one could see them. "John," Richard said, "we want to become rich. We have heard you can help people become rich very quickly." John looked at them with a smile that made Grace feel uneasy. "I can help you," John replied, "but it comes with a price." Grace's heart raced, but she was too eager to become rich. "What do we have to do?" she asked. John leaned in close. "To get the money you desire, you must make a sacrifice. You must bring me a child. A little baby, no older than 1 year. This is the price for great wealth." Richard and Grace looked at each other. They had no idea how terrible the choice they were making would be. They thought of how much money they could get, how they could live in luxury. They didn't think of the innocent life they would take. "We will do it," Richard said quickly, his mind already thinking about how rich they would become. John smiled. "Good. Go home now. When the time is right, bring the baby to me. I will take care of the rest." They left John's house feeling excited. They didn't think about the evil they were about to commit. They were blind to the suffering they would cause. All they wanted was money. And they would do anything to get it. The next day, Richard and Grace began to plan. They spoke to each other in secret, knowing they couldn't tell anyone what they were doing. Richard thought of a way to get the baby they needed. They had heard of a woman in the village who had just given birth. She was poor and had no one to help her. They decided to take the child from her. It would be easy. They waited until nightfall. Richard and Grace quietly walked to the woman's house. The woman was asleep, and her baby was in a small cot by the window. Grace looked at the baby, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. This was the moment. Richard gently picked up the baby, and Grace whispered a prayer, asking for strength. They quickly left the house and walked into the dark night. They had done the unthinkable, and they didn't feel the weight of their crime. They felt only greed. When they arrived at John's house, he was waiting for them. He took the baby from their hands without saying a word, then led them inside. He told them to wait in the dark room while he prepared the ritual. Richard and Grace didn't know what was happening. They didn't care. They were excited about what would come next. A loud noise came from the next room, followed by the sound of boiling water. Grace hesitated, her stomach churning with unease. "What is he doing in there?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" Richard replied coldly. "We'll have the money soon." But Grace's curiosity got the better of her. She crept to the door and peered through a small crack. What she saw froze her in place. John was standing over a large pot of boiling water. He held the baby in his hands, muttering strange words. Suddenly, he plunged the baby into the pot. A scream tried to escape Grace's throat, but she stifled it with her hand. Her legs felt like jelly, and she stumbled back into the room where Richard sat. She could hardly breathe. "What's wrong?" Richard asked, his voice still filled with excitement. He boiled the baby," Grace stammered, her voice barely audible. Richard's face paled, but he quickly shook off the feeling. "It's what had to be done," he said firmly. "This is the price we pay." John emerged from the room, his expression calm and cold. "It is done," he said. "Your wealth will come soon." Richard and Grace left the house in silence. Grace's hands trembled, and her heart raced. But the thought of the riches ahead clouded her mind. She convinced herself that it was all worth it. The next day, they woke up to a different world. They had received a large sum of money, and their lives began to change. At first, everything seemed perfect. They bought new clothes, new furniture, and a car. They could afford anything they wanted. Their neighbors were amazed at how quickly they had become rich. But as the days passed, things began to change. Richard started to feel uneasy. He had nightmares about the baby they had taken and the boiling water. He couldn't sleep at night, and his mind was always filled with guilt. Grace, too, began to feel the weight of what they had done. But it was too late. The money had already come, and they couldn't give it back. They had made a terrible choice, a choice that would soon come back to destroy them. As the days went by, Richard and Grace's life grew more luxurious. They no longer worried about bills, food, or anything that once caused them stress. Their house was filled with expensive furniture, shiny appliances, and sparkling jewelry. People in the village started to gossip, whispering about the sudden rise of their wealth. They couldn't believe how quickly Richard and Grace had changed. But the couple couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At night, Richard would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts filled with the image of the baby they had taken. He heard cries in his dreams, cries that seemed to come from the child's mother. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the innocent face of the baby they had stolen. Grace tried to ignore her feelings, but deep down, she was afraid. She had hoped that once the money came, everything would feel better. But it didn't. It only brought unease. Still, she pushed her fears aside and enjoyed the wealth, buying new clothes and jewels, traveling to places she had never imagined. One evening, Richard came home from work early. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. Grace noticed right away. "What happened?" she asked, worried. I saw something today," Richard said, his voice trembling. "I was walking in the market, and I saw the woman whose baby we took. She was crying. She was looking for her child. I could see the pain in her eyes." Grace went cold. She had been trying to forget about the woman and the child, but now it felt like the past was catching up to them. "Richard, we can't think about that," Grace said quickly. "We have money now. We have everything we wanted. We must stay focused. We can't go back." But Richard couldn't shake the feeling. He felt like the baby's soul was following him, haunting him. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of the child. It was as if the baby was begging for justice, for the life that had been taken away. The nightmares grew worse. Richard started seeing shadows in his dreams, shadows that moved and whispered. They whispered his name, telling him he could never escape. He woke up sweating, heart pounding, unable to find peace. Grace, too, began to feel the pressure. One night, while she was cooking dinner, she looked out the window and saw a figure standing in the yard. It was a woman, dressed in a white gown, her face hidden by shadows. Grace gasped, her hands trembling. When she blinked, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" she asked Richard, who was sitting in the living room. He didn't answer. He was staring at the wall, lost in his thoughts. "Yes," he said finally. "I saw it too. It's the baby spirit." Grace turned pale. She had heard stories of spirits who sought revenge, but she never believed them. Now, she wasn't so sure. The next day, Richard received a call from John. The voice on the other end was cold and filled with warning. "The price of the ritual is more than you think," John said. "The spirits are angry. The baby's soul demands justice." Richard's heart raced. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It means the money will not last forever. The spirit will come for what it is owed." "It's only a matter of time," John replied. Richard hung up the phone, his hands shaking. The guilt was eating him alive. He could no longer ignore the consequences of what they had done. He tried to talk to Grace about it, but she refused to listen. She still wanted the wealth, the luxury, the life they had built. She didn't want to face the truth. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. Richard would hear footsteps when no one was around. He would feel cold breaths on his neck as he walked through the house. Grace, too, felt a chill in the air, but she told herself it was just her imagination. Then, one night, as Richard was coming home from work, he found Grace sitting alone in the living room, crying. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Grace, what happened?" Richard asked, rushing to her side. "I saw the baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was in the garden. It was crying, looking for its mother." Richard's heart sank. He couldn't deny it anymore. The guilt, the fear, it was all real. The spirit of the baby had come back to claim what was taken. That night, Richard decided he could no longer live with the fear. He had to go back to John, to ask him to fix what they had done. But when he arrived at John's house, he was met with a cold silence. The house was empty. John was nowhere to be found. Desperation began to take hold of Richard. He searched the village, asking anyone who might know where John had gone, but no one seemed to know. The rumors about John were growing darker. Some said he had disappeared after performing too many dark rituals. Others claimed he had vanished because the spirits had taken him. As the days passed, Richard and Grace's lives began to fall apart. Their wealth started to vanish. The money they had received from John was slowly disappearing, as if it were being pulled away by some unseen force. They could no longer afford the luxuries they had once enjoyed. Their house, once full of life and comfort, now felt empty and cold. Richard became ill, pale and weak, haunted by the guilt of his actions. Grace, too, grew tired and scared. She could no longer deny that they had made a terrible mistake. They had lost everything, and now, the spirits of the innocent baby were coming to collect. As the days passed, Richard and Grace's lives grew darker. The once beautiful house they had lived in now seemed like a prison. Every corner of their home felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. The once luxurious furniture and decorations began to gather dust, the gold and jewels losing their shine. Nothing felt good anymore. The money they had received from John was disappearing, as though some unseen force was taking it away. Richard's health continued to deteriorate. He was pale and weak, his body trembling with exhaustion. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the cries of the baby they had taken. He saw its face in his dreams, its eyes full of anger, demanding justice. It was as if the child's spirit was slowly suffocating him, draining his life away. Grace, too, was affected. The fear she had pushed away for so long now consumed her. She heard whispers in the dark, cold breaths on her neck, and saw shadows moving when no one was there. But what terrified her the most were the dreams. She saw the woman, the mother of the baby, standing in front of her, her eyes full of sorrow and pain. "You took my child," the woman whispered in Grace's ear. "Now you will suffer." The guilt was unbearable. The life they had once dreamed of, the money, the luxury, the comfort, was now nothing more than a cruel illusion. Every day felt like a nightmare, and there was no escape. One evening, Richard collapsed on the floor, unable to stand any longer. His body was burning with fever, his eyes filled with terror. Grace rushed to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. "Richard," she cried, shaking him. "Please, stay with me." "What's happening?" Richard opened his eyes, but they were no longer the eyes of the man she had married. His pupils were black, his face twisted in fear. "It's too late, Grace," he whispered. "The baby spirit is coming for us. We've made a terrible mistake. We can't run from it. We can't hide." Grace felt a cold chill sweep through the room, and suddenly, the lights flickered. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was the woman. The same woman from her dreams. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with sorrow, but there was a cold anger in them too. She was holding the baby in her arms, her face full of grief. "Do you see what you've done?" the woman said, her voice soft yet full of rage. "You took my child, and now you will pay for it." Grace backed away, her heart racing. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know it would end like this," she begged, her voice filled with terror. But the woman didn't respond. She only stared at Grace, her eyes piercing her very soul. Then, the baby in her arms began to cry, softly at first, but the sound grew louder, filling the room. The cries were so loud that Grace could feel them in her chest, shaking her to the core. Richard, trembling on the floor, raised his hand weakly, as if to reach for the woman. But it was too late. The moment his hand touched the air, he let out a scream of pain, his body writhing in agony. The baby's cries grew louder, and Richard's body twisted as if something was tearing him apart from the inside. Grace screamed, rushing to Richard, but the woman stopped her with a single, cold glance. "You cannot save him," the woman said. "He has taken a life, and now his own life is forfeit." Richard's screams grew more frantic, his body contorting in ways that seemed impossible. The walls of the house began to shake, the floor creaking as though the very foundation was breaking apart. The light flickered wildly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Grace could see the spirits of the past, children, mothers, and victims, gathering in the corners of the room, their eyes filled with anger and sorrow. "Please, no," Grace begged, falling to her knees. "I'll do anything. I give back the money. I return everything. Just let him go." But the woman's gaze was unyielding. "It is too late. You cannot undo what has been done. You have taken a life, and now you must pay the price." With that, Richard's scream suddenly stopped. His body went limp, his eyes wide and empty. Grace shook him desperately, but it was no use. He was gone. Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at the lifeless body of her husband. "Richard, no. Please." She sobbed, feeling the weight of their choices crush her heart. She had wanted the money, the luxury, but now all she had was pain and regret. The woman stood silently, holding the baby in her arms. Her face was calm now, but the anger in her eyes remained. She turned and slowly began to walk toward the door, disappearing into the shadows. Grace was left alone in the room, her heart shattered. The house, once filled with the joy of newfound wealth, was now empty, cold, and haunted. The money they had stolen, the life they had built, had all been taken away. Their greed, their desperation for wealth, had led them to this point, a point where nothing mattered anymore. With nothing left to hold on to, Grace collapsed beside Richard's body, her cries echoing through the empty house. The price of their actions had been paid, but the pain they felt would stay with them forever. The spirits of the past had come to claim what was theirs, and no amount of wealth could undo the suffering they had caused.